Hi everyone, Christopher Carvalho here, and today I'm joined by Tomas George. And Tomas is going to talk to us about camera techniques. Things, I suppose, Tomas, like frame rates?
Yes.
Maybe aperture?
Yes.
ISO?
Yep.
What else?
Shutter speed.
Shutter speed.
Yeah, that kind of good stuff.
Exposure.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Exposure triangle.
What about, and like focus and autofocus?
Yeah, all that stuff.
All the settings basically. So, because whenever I use a camera, like a DSLR, I just use the setting that I'm most comfortable with.
It's that auto.
Yeah. And, but I don't know what the other things are, and I'm like scared that I'm going to break it. So what's the most important thing? Or what would you start with out the gate? Is it like frame rate or something like that?
The most important thing is focus.
Focus.
Make sure your subject is in focus.
Make
Because
sure.
that doesn't matter your aperture, your ISO, your shutter speed. If your subject's out of focus, it's gonna look weird. A lot of cameras nowadays have eye focus. Auto eye focus is really good.
Oh, okay. So what if it
Just focuses on the eye.
Oh,
So it
okay.
locks in on the eye, which is really cool. So it depends what camera you have. If you're using the mirror.
Is that what happens when there's little squares on the eye?
Yeah.
Oh,
So it locks
okay.
on there. So you can use manual focus, but if you're manual focus and you move forward like this, it may go out of focus. But if you have autofocus, it's
Right.
going to follow the eye, at least follow the face and keep
Yeah.
you in focus. So just make sure you get the focus settings right. If you have like, I don't know, a microphone in a shot or something else, just make sure it's not focused on that. A lot of the cameras, you can select the region you want to focus, like the center, or you can have a certain square. So you want to lock it in and just make sure your subject is in focus. That's the most important thing.
So there's autofocus, there's manual focus.
Yes.
And what, it depends? Like,
The vast majority of the time, I'd use autofocus.
yeah.
However, if I'm filming a music video, you know, you get that effect where the background comes in focus and the object in the foreground blurs and vice versa.
Yeah.
That's manual focus.
Like in a film, sometimes it focuses.
You can do it with
changes.
auto, but it's better manual. In like any Hollywood movies or anything like that, it's all manual focus.
Yeah, right.
There's actually someone's job is just to move the focus ring.
Right.
So, but nowadays autofocus is pretty good.
So that's the most important thing. Get the focus right.
Yeah.
Right. So what's like, because sometimes, you know, you might record a video and then it's like, you're like, oh, it's dull. It's like dark. Or I've done that before.
Yeah.
Like, what's
Underexposed.
underexposed?
So underexposed means it's basically too dark. Overexposed means it's too light, too bright.
So what do you do? What's the?
It's called the exposure triangle. So you have to make sure, well, with video, I'd start off with the shutter speed. So exposure triangle is three things: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. But for video, I start with shutter speed. And shutter speed for video to look natural, like the natural blur you get, you want to have double the frame rate.
Double the frame rate.
So talking video like this, and we're not doing slow motion.
Okay.
In the PAL region, it's 25 frames per second.
PAL.
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 Yes, so find out, look online where you are, if you're PAL or NTSC. So North America's NTSC, which is 24 frames per second.
Yeah.
And Europe and Asia is PAL, which is 25 frames per second. So if you're in, let's say we're in PAL where we are now, so it's 25 frames per second, the shutter speed needs to be double that, so it needs to be 1/50th.
Say that again. So 1/50th if it's 25.
If you're in 24, it's 1/48th, or 1/50 should look fine as well.
It's double, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
That'll look a lot more natural.
Okay, cool.
So that's the first thing to do. The next thing is the aperture. So that's how much light is allowed into the camera. It's also how you get that blurry background effect. So aperture is measured in F stops. So you may see some cameras, it says like 2.8 or 1.8 or 1.4
Yeah, like
F4.
over F or like F next to it. Yeah.
So the higher the F number, the less light is let in. The lower the F stop number, the more light's let in. So if you have a 1.8, it's going to let more light in. And you're also going to get the blurry background.
Right, okay. So how do you get the blurry background? Because that
Lower
obviously
F
looks
stop number and
lower
further
F stop.
and far away from the background.
Far away from the background, low
F stop number.
F. So you want to be closer to the subject and have the...
Depends what you want. If you want that cool blurry background effect, far away from the background,
Right.
and then low F stop number. Some lenses go all the way down to 1.4. This one you're on right now is a 1.8.
Right.
And we can see the background's a little bit blurry. It's pretty cool.
Okay, cool. So we've got the frame rates and the aperture.
The
What
shutter
about
speed.
shutter speed? ISO?
Yeah, ISO is basically digital light. So ideally you want to use your base ISO, which is the lowest your camera can go. So if your camera has 80 ISO or 100 ISO, if you can use that, great. But if you set your shutter speed to say 1/50th, you set your aperture to the lowest it can go, say 1.8, and it's still like too dark, you can crank up the ISO.
Okay,
But
so
it's digital light, so that can add some noise. So ideally you want to have the ISO as low as possible, but some mirrorless cameras, like the new Sony cameras, it looks pretty cool when you use more ISO.
start low as you can go,
Yes.
and then go up depending on
Yeah.
what you need. Right. Okay.
So, however,
Right.
if you're outside, there can be too much light, and you have to use, if you want that blurry background effect, there's too much light coming in. So you have to use basically a pair of sunglasses for your camera, which is called an ND filter, which we're using right now. Because the lower the aperture, the more light comes in. You can put the ND filter on, and that kind of like adds some shades to your camera, so you can still get that blurry background effect outside if you have an ND filter that's strong enough.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So is that like, are those like the main settings that you'd concern yourself with?
Well, if you want to do slow motion, so what you want to do is slow it down in post. Let's say you want half speed slow motion, you have to double the frame rate.
Right, because it's smoother than that way?
Well, you can
or-
slow it down.
Yeah,
So if you double the frame rate, you've also got to double the shutter speed.
I see.
Yeah.
You've got double the frame rate, you've got double the shutter speed.
Yeah. In NTSC regions, you also have 30 frames per second, just to confuse you even more, and then that goes to 60 frames per second.
Okay, yeah, I'm confused.
But in PAL, it goes 25, 50, then 100.
Okay,
So if you want 1/4 slow motion, use 100 in PAL. Half slow motion, use 50. And normal, as you're talking right now, use 25. PAL's a little bit easier to understand. Look at here in the PAL region. And to confuse you even more, if you use NTSC in the PAL region or vice versa, and you're not using video lights, you can get some flickering. So if you ever see you get flickering on your camera,
yeah.
that's normally because you're in either a PAL region and it's set to NTSC or vice versa.
so that's like an artifact of the incorrect kind
To
of...
do with the hertz of the
Yeah,
lights.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
that's interesting. So I get a new camera, got it in my hand, I've got the viewfinder,
Yeah.
I've got the, what's the screen called? The
LCD
LCD display.
display, yeah.
And I want to get going. What's, you know, because I find it quite intimidating actually. Like it's like a lot, you know, and there's the thing at the top. Oh yeah, and you know, like you get these different settings. Like one looks like a mountain, one's a face.
Yeah.
Are they like auto?
Yeah, I would
preset?
just use manual.
Use manual.
Yeah. So the first thing I do, I'll charge the battery obviously, but
Yeah. Right.
I'd set the frame rate. So if you want to do a video where you're talking like this,
Yeah.
you're gonna set 25 frames per second. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, well, if you want to film in 4K, make sure it's set to 4K or whatever the highest you can go. So 25 frames per second, and then you set the shutter speed. So you want to set the shutter speed as 1/50th. That's double the number for the frame rate. And then depending on what you do, but normally you want to have that blurry background, a lot of people do, it makes it look a bit more slick. You set the aperture, and if you want the blurry background, you set it as low as possible. But if you're taking a landscape photo or a video, and you want to have like the mountains in focus and stuff, you use a higher f-stop number.
A higher f-stop number.
But a higher f-stop number, you won't really get that blurry background.
Right. That's, yeah, and that's for like mountains and stuff.
If you
Or
want
whatever.
things in the background to be in focus.
If you want things in the background to
Yeah.
be, you need a higher
Yeah.
f-stop
Yes.
number. Okay.
But that
cool.
less light into the camera,
Yeah.
and then you might have to crank up the ISO. You might have to increase the ISO, which add digital light, which won't look quite as good.
So everything kind of affects everything.
Yeah, it's called the exposure triangle.
The exposure
So the
triangle.
shutter speed, the aperture, and ISO all affect each other.
The shutter speed,
The aperture, and the
aperture,
ISO.
and ISO.
Yeah, ISO lasts. So, but video, you kind of have to have the shutter speed fixed. Photo, you can kind of change that. But in video, shutter speed, double the frame rate. Aperture, depending on if you want that blurry background or not. If you do, low f-stop number, and then ISO to kind of compensate.
The exposure
The
triangle.
exposure triangle.
Okay,
And then
cool.
of course you get white balance and more stuff as well.
Right. You mentioned like batteries earlier. What are like some like best practices, kind of safety things that, you know, maybe something, you know, like, you know, having a backup of something or whatever?
Yeah. You can get dummy batteries. So you can get batteries that plug into the camera, that plug into the wall like a power supply. So your battery isn't going to run out. Because what you don't want to do is be in the middle of filming the video, then the camera turns off because the battery's run out. Another thing, make sure you got a big SD card.
Yeah.
I recommend 128 gig.
Yeah.
You got plenty. That lasts you an hour, maybe longer.
You can get those
4K.
like anywhere, can't you?
Yeah.
I
like SanDisk one, but
SanDisk, yeah. So I've had it before where it just stops recording after 20 minutes. Like,
yes.
What is that?
That is a limitation that a lot of cameras have, but nowadays the newer Sony cameras, for example, the ones we're using right now, the A7S III and the A7 IV, they don't have a limitation. They stop recording if it either overheats or the SD card gets full or if the battery dies.
Because we've had that.
Yes.
The overheat thing.
Yes.
And then you change
the settings, to stop it overheating as much.
Right.
Well, not to stop it overheating, to change the settings so it doesn't switch off as easily.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff, huh?
There's a lot of stuff.
But what's like the main, like someone just got a DSLR, right? Let's say.
Yeah.
Main tip, like what's the one thing?
Don't use the kit lens that comes with the camera.
Don't use the kit
it's always
lens.
really bad.
Right,
it normally starts like an F5 or something.
F5?
Yeah, you want to get like an F1.8, really. At least a 2.8.
Sorry, is that the F stop?
Yeah. You want a lens that goes to at least 2.8, ideally 1.8. And you really want to get a prime lens. If you like running around, you're taking photos and stuff, you might want a zoom lens, but the prime lens will look better. If you get Canon, you can get like a Canon. It's called Nifty 50 at 1.8, 50mm, for like, I don't know, like $200 or something. They're pretty good.
Nifty 50.
That's what it's called.
Cool.
And that brings me on to the focal length of the camera as well.
Ah.
So it's different. You hear like a 24, a 35, a 50. Hear those kind of numbers?
That's a lot of numbers.
So basically, the lower the number, the more kind of wide it is, and all like zoomed out, I guess it is.
Like wide lens, wide
so
shot.
what we see of our eyes is about 50mm, which is why a lot of 50mm is very popular portraits, because it's kind of what we look like. But if you want that more kind of warped, like kind of zoomed out YouTube look, that could be like a 24mm.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a 50mm, that needs to be further away than if you have a 24mm. It can be closer. So it depends on your space as well. If you have a big room, maybe you want like a 50mm, but if you have like a tight space, maybe a 24, even a 35mm.
Okay.
So,
and what's like the number one mistake people make, like out the gate?
probably they stick it on auto, and then it kind of the shutter speed doesn't double the. I've done this many times. The shutter speed doesn't double the frame rate, and it kind of looks unnatural when they move the hands. Either it's too slow or it looks too fast. I've
done loads of videos where, because I you know, auto everything, and I'm like, oh, it changes in the video.
Yeah.
You know?
Auto ISO. If you use auto ISO, then like say the sun, like here for example, if a cloud go past, the ISO will compensate and it go brighter, then it'll change. Same with auto white balance, the colors can change and stuff. So you want to use manual.
You want to use manual.
If you're doing a vlog and you're walking around, you kind of want auto ISO.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if you're on a tripod like this, manual.
So manual all the things really, apart from like when you're moving around and
exactly.
That's when you want to do
But you need to know what frame rate is, what you want to film. Do you want slow motion? Do you want it like regular speed? They need to make sure the shutter speed is double the frame rate. Set the aperture, depending on if you want the blurry background or not, and then ISO to compensate. Not most cameras have a little meter as well. So 0 means like it's properly exposed. If it's over, it'd be too bright. If it's under, it'd be too dark. You can change it a little bit, the exposure in movie editing, video editing software, but I recommend getting it as good as you can on the camera to start with.
And what about audio?
Yes.
So, because the camera will have a microphone, but
it sucks.
Yeah. So what do?
You get a microphone. No, it depends. If you're going to be up close to the camera, you can get like a shotgun mic on top.
Right.
Like these ones here, these are lavalier mics.
Because there's also those like, are they the Rode ones that, is it Rode?
Yeah, Wireless Go, they have them.
on the top of the camera.
Oh, okay, the video mics. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, really with a shotgun, mate, you want to have it close.
Yeah.
In an ideal situation, I probably wouldn't even record the audio into the camera. I'd record it into an audio interface and into a computer. The preamps are going to sound better on the camera. But if you're outside like this, you can't really have a laptop with you. Use a little mic and it'll go into the camera.
And clap, of course.
Clap. Right? And just in case there's an issue with sync, or like the audio doesn't record on the camera, but it records on the microphone, for example, if you clap, you can sync it. So I always like to do 3 claps so you can sync it.
Right.
Yeah, sync, actually, I may be wrong, maybe sync is more important than focus. If something's at sync, it looks really weird. I'd say sync and focus are the most important things. If we're talking about audio, that is.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So thanks for that. That's all your top tips for using
Top tips, yeah. I've talked quite a lot of information. Try not to get overwhelmed, but you will need to study up. You will need to learn about the exposure triangle. You will need to learn about this stuff.
Exposure triangle, that's like for me, that's one, that makes sense because it's like, oh yeah, like if you do more of this, you might need less of that, you know.
But in photography, the shutter speed, it doesn't have to be double the frame rate. But if you have a low shutter speed, you may get the photo a bit blurry, so just be aware of that as well.
Okay, cool. Okay. Thank you for that, Thomas. That's really useful. So for anyone using like a new camera, like a DSLR, that sort of thing.
Yeah, mirrorless cameras.
Mirrorless cameras.
Yeah.
Okay,
like the cameras we're shooting on right now, mirrorless cameras.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but,
and what are we shooting with right now?
Okay, the shot we can see now is a Sony A7 IV with the 1.8 35mm lens, and the one you're looking at right now is the Sony A7S with the 55 1.8mm lens. Great,
thank you for coming on, Thomas. If you'd like to learn more about Tomas George, go to tomasgeorge.com or digitalmusicmasters.com.
Yeah, it's mostly music production tutorials, but we do have a few video production tutorials here and there as well.
Okay, cool. And check out Tomas George's YouTube channel as well. The links are in the description.